We have a lot of tough ground to cover today, but the stories you're about to hear are as tough as any you will ever hear. The data tells us that 1 in 4 girls who turn 18 in the United States this year will have been sexually abused. 1 in 6 boys. 100,000 children will be sexually abused in the United States this year. Those are devastating numbers, and what they say about us as a society is deeply discouraging. An awful lot of the relationships that ultimately lead to the sexual abuse of children begin with adults in trusting positions of great power. That's how adults get access to kids. Some of those relationships happen at camp. Some of those relationships could begin at your camp this summer. We know how to stop child sexual abuse. We know how to stop it because there's a pattern that a predator uses to get access to kids that is repeated time after time. That pattern gives us the opportunity to recognize the warning signs of child sexual abuse and gives us the opportunity to stop the abuse from progressing or even from occurring in the first place. The stories that you're about to hear are stories just like that, where an adult used his position of power and trust to get access to kids that ultimately resulted in horrific activities. Listen to these stories. Think about how your role as a camp counselor, done properly, could have stopped this abuse from happening. Then visit with your colleagues and chat about how these situations might present themselves at your camp this summer and what you might do to prevent them. We are enlisting you as a volunteer in a revolution to eradicate child sexual abuse in America. And that revolution begins at your camp this summer.
Over the past few years, we've investigated dozens of cases of adult-to-child sexual abuse, really way too many, and many of those happening at camp. One example is a 18-year-old honors student who had been a camper at camp, had now moved up to camp counselor, so everybody knew him. And he would, every week of camp, pick out one of his favorite boys, usually around 12 years old, that he would show special attention to. He would single out from the rest of the group. He became friends with them on Facebook. And it turns out that over the course of 4 weeks during that summer, he sexually abused 2 children, touching their genitals at times before bed and on the bus when there were other people around, but it was very hard to supervise. And we also recently investigated the case of a camp director. Now, this camp director lived on campus, on the center of the camp. His residence was actually connected to the dining hall. And what he had done was blacked out the windows of his residence so that no one could see in there. Now, I know that sounds strange, and kind of the red flags go up immediately, but he gave a reason for it that people accepted because they trusted him. The reason was, this is my residence, this is where I live, just like hanging curtains or blinds, I need to have my privacy. So people accepted that. Unfortunately, what the privacy allowed him to do was to break some other rules at camp. He would have visitors over, campers, and when he came over, he had the opportunity to give them alcohol, to show them pornography, to break down their barriers, and to eventually sexually abuse the children when he was in a one-on-one situation with them. There was a camp counselor and camp director who over the course of about 10 years worked for 3 different camps. And over that time, he would gain the trust of vulnerable children, he would gain the trust of their parents, he would gain the trust of his supervisors and all of the co-workers. Not until about, I said, 10 years after working in camp, he was finally arrested for charges of child pornography. And there was a lot of suspicion that during his time, the children that he was spending more time with, he may have been sexually abusing.
So one story that I'm really close to, my first year as an executive camp director, made it to the last day of summer and was sitting in my office right after the last kid left, and had my assistant directors saying, wow, it was, challenging but a great summer. Nothing really bad had happened, or so we had thought. And then my phone rang, and it was a mother who called me to tell me that her son had just come home, and the first thing he did was tell her that his counselor, Miguel, would touch him as he put him to sleep each night in his private areas. My first reaction was to say, I can't believe it. Miguel was one of our best counselors. I tried to assure the mom, maybe she needed to go back and talk to her son, just because couldn't be. Miguel had worked at camp for 2 years, was an international staff counselor, and until that call, I had always thought he was one of my best staff members. He had spent almost all of his free time with kids. He'd be at break time, and he wouldn't need the break. He would be hanging out at the tennis courts or the tetherball courts and talking with kids. I'd catch his co-counselor sometimes. The staff were allowed to have a break at 10 o'clock at night, and sometimes I would see his co-counselors at 9:30, and I said, what are you doing? And they say, well, Miguel said he'll put the kids to bed for me, so I had a little extra time. All of the time thinking that was the right thing. And Miguel was doing all these extra things as kind of what we want from our staff. Unfortunately, he was touching kids. To make it worse, as we started our investigation, we sent letters out to the campers in his cabin from both summers. After the first summer, as a lot of international staff do, they stayed in the United States to travel, and he went from camper's house to camper's house, where there were times where he was left alone babysitting kids, and some really horrific things happened. So while we certainly want to trust our staff, we also have to know what to look for. And what we do know about abusers is oftentimes they not only do they groom the child, I certainly was groomed. I believed in Miguel, and I was wrong. This past year in the news, we've heard a lot about Jerry Sandusky, some Catholic priests, and a number of other horrific incidences. At camp, what we know, like Jerry Sandusky, who started a foundation to serve kids, and serve kids who were oftentimes at risk, needy, they're attracted to kids, and they're attracted to organizations like YMCAs, Jewish community centers, camps. So we have to be aware, and we have to know what to look for.
I hope you've had another good conversation about, frankly, a very difficult topic, but one I promise you every single camp will face this summer. The concept of peer-to-peer sexual abuse is difficult to think about, but it is very prevalent. So we're going to help you process a little bit of our prevention methods, and again, we'll probably capture some of the things that you've already discussed. So I want to start with resetting the frame. And Josh, I want to ask you, we spent a lot of time a few minutes ago on adult child sexual abuse prevention. Now we're talking about peer-to-peer sexual abuse prevention. They're very different dynamics, aren't they?
They are. In adult-to-adult child sexual abuse, the adult is finding the opportunities, finding their way into the organization.
Really creating their own opportunities.
Yes, finding where they can gain access and do all the grooming that we talked about in the last episode. When it comes to peer-to-peer abuse, the opportunities are presented to kids where they're in the bathroom and they're not being supervised. We're leaving them alone in cabins. So the opportunity is really presented to them. They're not seeking them out normally.
So in the peer-to-peer cases, it's a more opportunistic situation. And Gareth, you and I spend a lot of time talking about bullying, and it appears anymore that you can't watch a TV show or open a newspaper that there isn't some sort of a discussion in the media about bullying. Help us to understand and define bullying effectively so that we're not subject to kind of the overuse of the term.
Sure. A single incident is not bullying, and that's what we often see on the media when we have someone who was hurt physically or somebody who was teased online. The media will take that one example and say it was clearly bullying that often led to what got it on the news, a child committing suicide or something of that nature. Bullying involves two things. One is an imbalance of power, where one is clearly using a kind of social dominance over the other, and that plays out either physically or emotionally. But also it happens over time. A single incident is not bullying.
So we see, again, a pattern of behavior where there is this difference in power. Is there a connection between bullying and eventual sexual abuse?
There is. In the incidents that we've seen, a good number of the peer-to-peer sexual abuse incidents started with some level of bullying. And again, it's important to realize that it happened over time. So what may have started with teasing, with physical bullying, with knocking the books out of somebody's hands, and that then lasted throughout an entire summer, and then into the school year, possibly online as well. When those children then had an opportunity where they were unsupervised and the bullying was allowed to escalate, it may have then turned into what we call peer-to-peer sexual abuse. And that abuse, where one child may touch another child inappropriately, may force the other child to touch them, that's often not motivated sexually, as you would see in an adult-to-child episode, but is more motivated by the power structure that's similar to bullying.
So, had we stopped the bullying at some point, we would have stopped the eventual sexual episode.
Yes, if we had not allowed the bullying to continue and to escalate, then it likely would not have gotten to the point where, in an unsupervised location, the bullying progressed into peer-to-peer sexual abuse.
Josh, we hear all the time when there's been peer-to-peer sexual abuse or there's been an incident of bullying, that kids will be kids. There's nothing you can do about it. Kids will be kids. But I know you feel strongly that that's not a fair answer.
Yeah, I don't believe in that at all. I think in camps we have the opportunity to teach values. And I've always believed if we can replicate what we do in camp outside in the rest of the world, we'd be better off. And I think when we teach values and we teach kids to look out for each other and the values of honesty, caring, respect, responsibility, and we live those, we're creating a culture within our camps that is making it safe for kids. And they're safe to share what's going on.
So now when we get to a culture of respect, that's why we don't bully one another, because we respect one another. So in stopping it from happening, we're bringing kids back to our values.
Absolutely.
So what you're suggesting is a safety approach is living our values.
I agree.
Gareth, so that's interesting because we do have some rules that I think spring from this culture of respect. What are the rules?
It all comes down to supervision. What Josh mentioned in making sure we're teaching values takes engaged supervision when you're working with the campers. But we also know that there are high-risk areas where peer-to-peer abuse eventually does play out in those opportunistic locations. And those are the locations that are the hardest for us to supervise. Bathrooms, locker rooms, anywhere where children may be in less clothes or be wet, those are the areas that take additional supervision. So when we talk about children being supervised 100% of the time, that means when we're bringing kids to a bathroom, we need to be standing in the doorway. We need to be sending only one child into the stall at a time. We need to be constantly communicating with those children. If we can't have perfect line of sight because genders are different or whatever it might be, they still know we're engaged with them and they are not on their own.
Help me with this one, because from time to time we'll hear people say, this particularly happens in day camp, we have a buddy system. So Josh and Gareth are going to go off to the bathroom together. Or maybe I have a rule of 3, which is interpreted as Josh and Gareth and Kevin can go to the bathroom together. That sounds like that's not consistent with what you're suggesting.
No, that doesn't work. With a buddy system, you have a setup for one child to bully or abuse the other child when they're not supervised. In a rule of 3, where one of the 3 is not a counselor, you have a setup for 2 children to bully one child or to sexually abuse that child. So even in those areas that are difficult to supervise, we can't let down that supervision rule. In a rule of 3, 1 or 2 need to be counselors.
So it's real that there's a logistical problem, of particularly in day camp, of when my kids need to go to the bathroom. So this gets back to the issue of planning. If you've got a bunch of kids, it's important to take them all to the bathroom at the beginning of the session. Or if one of them needs to go to the bathroom, we're going to take a whole bunch of them to the bathroom so that we keep our ratios appropriate. This is back to planning ahead, being the supervisor of the environment, and making sure that, as Josh and Gareth said, we don't present the opportunity to these kids. Because if we have allowed the bullying to go on and we then present them with an opportunity where the kids are partially clothed or wet, we're going to have a bad situation. So staying ahead of those things is hugely important. And the most important way to stay ahead of those things is to make sure that we live our values every moment of every day.